Long before Monaco became a playground for billionaires, Formula One champions, and Hollywood royalty, it was nothing more than a rocky fortress overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Few who visit the prince's palace today realize that beneath its elegant halls lies one of Europe's oldest and darkest legends. For more than 700 years, whispers have followed the House of Grimaldi. They speak of broken marriages, children buried before their parents, rulers driven from their throne, widows dressed in black, and a royal family that seemed unable to escape tragedy no matter how much wealth or power it accumulated. Historians cannot prove that a curse exists, nor can they verify the event that supposedly gave birth to it. Yet the legend has refused to die, because every generation seemed to add another chapter to the story. It begins not with a prince, a queen, or a palace, but with a young woman whose name disappeared from history. She owned no land, commanded no army, and left behind no written account. According to legend, she possessed only one thing that no nobleman could take from her after everything else had been stolen: her final words. Whether those words changed history or simply became the way later generations explained centuries of heartbreak remains one of Monaco's greatest mysteries. The woman history forgot. The 13th century was a dangerous time to be born poor. Across Europe, noble families fought for power while ordinary people survived at their mercy. Justice rarely belonged to those without wealth or influence. In villages surrounding the Ligurian coast, stories spread by word of mouth because few common people could read or write. According to one of Monaco's oldest legends, a young village woman crossed paths with a member of the Grimaldi family during this turbulent period. Different versions tell the story differently. Some say she was admired for her beauty. Others claim she rejected the advances of a powerful nobleman. Every version ends the same way. She was overpowered by a Grimaldi ancestor who believed his status placed him beyond consequence. When she sought justice, none came. The noble returned to his castle. The woman returned to a life forever changed. In an age where kings decided laws and noble families protected one another, there was nowhere left to appeal. According to the legend, she turned toward the castle one final time and pronounced a sentence that no court could issue. She declared that the Grimaldi family would never know lasting happiness in marriage, and that every generation would carry the burden of what had been done to her. No chronicler recorded her name. No monk copied her story into a manuscript. If she truly existed, history remembered the family that held power and forgot the woman who had none. Yet while her name vanished, the words attributed to her survived for centuries. Legends often grow where justice is absent. They become the language people use when the powerful cannot be punished by earthly courts. Whether the curse was ever spoken exactly as later generations repeated, it is impossible to know. What is certain is that the legend became inseparable from the Grimaldi family long before modern newspapers began reporting their tragedies. The dynasty is born. Only a few years after the legend is said to have begun, another event transformed the Grimaldi family forever. In January 1297, François Grimaldi approached the fortress of Monaco disguised as a Franciscan monk. Medieval monasteries were places of refuge, and monks were rarely viewed as threats. The guards opened the gates. Hidden soldiers rushed inside. The fortress fell. That moment became one of the most famous acts of deception in European history and established the Grimaldi family's claim to Monaco. Even today, Monaco's coat of arms features two monks holding swords, commemorating the deception that founded the dynasty. Yet seizing the fortress did not bring peace. Powerful neighbors repeatedly tried to reclaim Monaco. The Grimaldis were driven from power more than once, forced into exile, then fought their way back again. Alliances shifted constantly. Genoa, France, Spain, and local rival families all competed for influence over the tiny principality. Every generation inherited enemies created by the one before it. The palace survived sieges, political betrayals, financial crises, and assassination plots. The dynasty endured because each ruler understood that Monaco's survival depended on adapting to far stronger kingdoms surrounding it. To later generations, these endless struggles seem to confirm that peace never remained with the Grimaldis for long. Whether viewed as ordinary medieval politics or the first echoes of an ancient curse, hardship became woven into the family's identity. The palace remained standing, but stability always appeared temporary. Every victory seemed to carry the promise of another loss waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. A dynasty that could never rest. The Grimaldi family had won Monaco, but keeping it proved far more difficult than taking it. The principality occupied barely 1 square mile of land, surrounded by kingdoms that viewed it as little more than a strategic prize. Every ruler inherited the same impossible task: survive without provoking powers capable of destroying them. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Monaco changed alliances repeatedly, pledging loyalty first to one kingdom and then another as Europe shifted through wars, religious conflicts, and political upheaval. Every treaty purchased temporary safety at the cost of new enemies. Members of the Grimaldi family lived with constant suspicion, aware that trusted advisors could become traitors and neighboring rulers could become invaders without warning. Marriage, which was supposed to secure peace, often became another battlefield. Royal unions were arranged for politics rather than affection, binding families together while quietly planting resentment that lasted for generations. Long before newspapers began calling it the Grimaldi curse, people living in Monaco noticed something unsettling. Every generation seemed to achieve greatness only after paying an extraordinary personal price. Victory was rarely followed by peace. Prosperity was rarely followed by contentment. The palace remained standing, while those who ruled within its walls seemed destined to carry burdens invisible to the world outside. As the centuries passed, Monaco survived revolutions that erased kingdoms across Europe. The French Revolution swept away ancient dynasties, and even the Grimaldis could not escape its reach. In 1793, revolutionary France abolished the principality. The Grimaldi family lost their throne. Their palace was seized. Monaco ceased to exist as an independent state and became part of France. Nearly 500 years after François Grimaldi entered the fortress disguised as a monk, his descendants found themselves without a kingdom. For more than 20 years, the dynasty watched others govern the land their ancestors had fought to possess. Some family members lived in exile. Others struggled financially after generations of privilege. To supporters of the old legend, the fall of Monaco appeared to be another chapter in the family's long history of suffering. Yet history offers another explanation. Europe itself had entered an age when monarchies everywhere were collapsing before revolutionary ideals. The Grimaldis eventually regained their throne after Napoleon's defeat, but the restoration carried a lasting lesson. Even a dynasty that had survived wars, assassinations, and foreign invasions could lose everything almost overnight. When the 19th century arrived, Monaco faced a different crisis. The principality had become poor. Two of its largest towns, Menton and Roquebrune, rebelled against Grimaldi rule and eventually broke away with French support, stripping Monaco of nearly 95% of its territory. The tiny nation was reduced to little more than the rocky peninsula visitors recognize today. Many believed the principality would disappear entirely. Prince Charles III refused to accept that fate. Instead of relying on military strength, he made a decision that transformed Monaco forever. He approved the construction of a luxurious casino in the district that would later bear his name, Monte Carlo. Wealthy visitors from across Europe arrived to gamble, invest, and vacation. Railroads connected Monaco to France. Hotels, gardens, theaters, and elegant boulevards followed. Within a generation, a nation once threatened with extinction became one of the richest places in Europe. The Grimaldis had once again accomplished the impossible. Yet as Monaco entered its golden age, another pattern quietly emerged. The principality flourished beyond imagination, while the private lives of many who ruled it continued to unfold under the weight of heartbreak, public scrutiny, and personal loss. The palace had finally found prosperity. Lasting peace remained far more elusive. The princess who saved a dynasty and paid for it. By the beginning of the 20th century, Monaco had become one of Europe's most glamorous destinations, but behind the elegance lay an uncomfortable truth. The Grimaldi family faced a succession crisis that threatened everything their ancestors had fought to preserve. Prince Albert I, known as the Navigator Prince for his scientific expeditions and passion for oceanography, had only one legitimate son, Prince Louis. The problem was that Louis remained unmarried and had no legitimate heir. If the dynasty ended with him, Monaco risked falling under French control according to agreements that governed the principality. The survival of 7 centuries of Grimaldi rule suddenly depended on a single child who had not been born within a royal marriage. That child was Charlotte Louvet. Born in 1898 to Prince Louis and a young Algerian woman named Marie Juliette Louvet, Charlotte entered the world far from the palace walls. Her parents never married, and under Monaco's laws, she had no automatic right to inherit the throne. She spent much of her childhood away from her father, while Europe edged toward the First World War. As Louis grew older, the succession crisis became impossible to ignore. In 1919, Charlotte was formally adopted by her father and declared a legitimate member of the Grimaldi family. Overnight, the young woman who had lived outside the royal household became the future of Monaco itself. The decision saved the dynasty, but it also transformed Charlotte from a private citizen into a political necessity. Her future no longer belonged entirely to her. It belonged to Monaco. Soon afterward, Charlotte married Count Pierre de Polignac, a French aristocrat who agreed to adopt the Grimaldi name so the dynasty would continue. On paper, the marriage solved another constitutional problem. In reality, it quickly unraveled. The couple shared little affection and lived increasingly separate lives. Public appearances concealed growing unhappiness behind palace doors. They had two children, Antoinette and Rainier, but the relationship deteriorated beyond repair. Eventually, they separated, and Charlotte gradually withdrew from royal duties. Years later, she voluntarily surrendered her place in the line of succession to her son, Rainier. She chose a quieter life devoted to art, literature, and animal welfare, far from the relentless expectations of the palace. To historians, Charlotte's story reflects the immense personal sacrifices demanded by monarchy. To believers in the Grimaldi legend, she became another example of a marriage that never found lasting happiness. The dynasty had been saved, but once again, the family at its center paid a deeply personal price. As Europe emerged from two devastating world wars, Prince Rainier III inherited a principality that had survived against extraordinary odds. Monaco was secure, wealthy, and internationally respected, yet it lacked something no law or treaty could guarantee: a future that inspired hope. Rainier understood that Monaco needed more than political stability. It needed a story the world would believe in. He could not have imagined that the woman who would give Monaco its greatest fairy tale would also become the tragedy that defined his reign. Before the world knew her as Princess Grace, she was one of Hollywood's brightest stars. Their meeting would transform Monaco forever, attracting global attention unlike anything the principality had ever experienced. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Grimaldi family had finally escaped the shadow that had followed them for centuries. The world watched a prince marry a movie star and believed the legend had finally come to an end. It had only reached its most famous chapter. The fairy tale that captivated the world. By the mid-1950s, Prince Rainier III faced a challenge that extended far beyond romance. Monaco needed an heir, but it also needed visibility. The tiny principality had survived revolutions, wars, and financial uncertainty, yet it remained overshadowed by Europe's larger kingdoms. Across the Atlantic, Hollywood actress Grace Kelly had become one of the most admired women in the world. Elegant, intelligent, and already an Academy Award winner before turning 30, she seemed to embody everything audiences associated with sophistication. In 1955, while attending the Cannes Film Festival, Grace agreed to visit Prince Rainier at the prince's palace during a magazine photo session arranged by Paris Match. Neither expected that brief meeting to alter the course of Monaco's history. Their courtship unfolded quietly across continents through letters and carefully planned visits before Rainier traveled to the United States to ask Grace's family for permission to marry her. On April 19, 1956, the world watched what newspapers called the wedding of the century. More than 30 million people followed the ceremony through television broadcasts and newsreels. Hollywood had given Monaco something no army or treaty ever could: global fascination. Grace left behind a career at its peak, stepping away from film forever to become Princess of Monaco. Her wedding dress, designed by MGM costume designer Helen Rose, became one of the most celebrated gowns in history. Monaco was no longer simply a wealthy Mediterranean principality. It had become the world's fairy tale kingdom. The transformation reached far beyond the palace gates. Tourism surged. International investors arrived. Monte Carlo became synonymous with elegance, luxury, and royalty. Prince Rainier modernized the principality while Grace embraced charitable work, cultural organizations, children's hospitals, and the arts. Together, they projected an image of stability and devotion that captivated millions. They raised 3 children: Princess Caroline, Prince Albert, and Princess Stephanie, while carefully balancing public duty with private family life. To the outside world, the Grimaldis appeared to have accomplished what no previous generation had managed. The palace was prosperous. The royal marriage appeared loving. The children grew up under the Mediterranean sun, surrounded by beauty few families could imagine. For a time, even those familiar with Monaco's oldest legend began to wonder whether history had finally taken a different course. The stories of unhappy marriages and recurring tragedy seemed to belong to another century. Grace Kelly had become more than a princess. She had become the symbol of Monaco itself. On the afternoon of September 13th, 1982, that illusion ended. Princess Grace left the family's country home at Rock Angel with her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie. The drive to Monaco normally took less than half an hour along narrow mountain roads overlooking the Mediterranean. Somewhere during the descent, Grace lost control of the Rover sedan. The car crossed into the opposite lane, struck a stone barrier, and plunged nearly 120 feet down the rocky hillside before coming to rest among trees below. Rescue workers reached the wreckage quickly, but Grace had suffered catastrophic injuries. Stephanie survived with multiple fractures and serious trauma. The following evening, after doctors determined there was no hope of recovery, Princess Grace died at the age of 52. Her funeral drew monarchs, presidents, world leaders, and Hollywood stars from around the globe. Millions watched once again. Not a royal wedding this time, but a royal farewell. Within days, newspapers revived a story that had largely faded into folklore. Headlines across Europe referred to the centuries-old Grimaldi curse. Whether writers believed the legend mattered less than the undeniable pattern they believed readers would recognize. Monaco had lost the woman who had brought it unprecedented happiness, and Prince Rainier never remarried. Friends later described him as a man forever changed by grief. For the remaining 23 years of his life, Grace's photograph remained on his desk, and those closest to him said the palace never truly felt the same again. The children who grew up inside a legend. Grace Kelly's funeral marked the end of Monaco's fairy tale, but it became the beginning of another chapter that would keep the Grimaldi legend alive. For the first time, Prince Rainier faced the impossible task of raising 3 young adults while carrying the weight of personal grief and an entire nation's expectations. Princess Caroline was 25. Prince Albert was 24. Princess Stephanie was only 17 and still recovering from the crash that had taken her mother. None of them could escape the fact that millions of people had watched the tragedy unfold. Their private sorrow became international news, and every decision they made afterward will be measured against the legend that had followed their family for centuries. Princess Caroline, the eldest, had always resembled her mother in grace and composure. She became Monaco's unofficial First Lady, assuming many of Grace's public responsibilities almost immediately. Years earlier, she had married French banker Philippe Junot, but the marriage lasted barely 2 years before ending in divorce. Friends described the relationship as fundamentally incompatible from the beginning. Caroline eventually found happiness again with Italian businessman Stefano Casiraghi. Unlike many who entered royal circles, Stefano never sought the spotlight. Together, they built a quieter life and welcomed 3 children. Those close to the family believed Caroline had finally found the stability that had eluded earlier generations. On October 3, 1990, everything changed. Stefano entered an offshore powerboat race off the coast of Monaco, a sport he had dominated for years. During the competition, his boat struck a wave at high speed, flipped violently, and broke apart on impact. Stefano was killed instantly. He was only 30 years old. Caroline was widowed at 33 with 3 young children. Newspapers across Europe reached for the same explanation they had used after Grace Kelly's death. Another marriage. Another devastating loss. Another chapter added to the Grimaldi legend. Princess Stephanie carried a different burden. She had survived the accident that killed her mother, and almost immediately rumors began circulating that she had been driving the car. Official investigations found no evidence to support those claims, yet the speculation persisted for years, forcing Stephanie to relive the tragedy every time it resurfaced. She struggled under relentless media attention unlike anything her mother had experienced. Every friendship became gossip. Every relationship became front-page news. Every attempt to live independently invited criticism. She pursued fashion, music, and charitable work, trying to define herself beyond the tragedy that had shaped her youth, but the public rarely allowed her to escape it. In interviews years later, Stephanie admitted that the accident remained the defining event of her life. She had survived physically, yet she spent decades carrying an emotional weight that few people could fully understand. To believers in the old legend, another generation had once again paid a painful price. To others, Stephanie's story revealed the immense psychological burden of growing up inside one of the world's most scrutinized royal families. While his sisters endured personal loss and constant media attention, Prince Albert faced a different responsibility. One day, he would inherit not only the throne of Monaco, but also the expectations of a dynasty that had survived for more than 700 years. From childhood, Albert had been prepared for that role. Educated internationally, fluent in multiple languages, and an accomplished athlete, he represented Monaco in 5 Winter Olympic Games. Yet public attention rarely focused on his achievements. Instead, headlines questioned when he would marry and produce an heir. Every relationship became international speculation because the future of the dynasty depended upon him. As the years passed and Albert remained unmarried, newspapers increasingly revived the legend that no Grimaldi could find lasting happiness in marriage. What had once been medieval folklore was now repeated in modern magazines and television documentaries. The palace rarely responded. The legend no longer needed defenders. 7 centuries of history had ensured that it would continue to tell itself. The prince who could not escape his family name. On April 6, 2005, Prince Rainier III died after nearly 56 years on the throne. He had guided Monaco from a struggling principality into one of the wealthiest nations in the world, but those closest to him often remarked that he never truly recovered from losing Grace Kelly. His death marked the end of an era. Prince Albert II inherited not only the throne but also 7 centuries of history, expectations, and a legend that refused to disappear. Unlike most men, Albert's personal life was never entirely his own. Every relationship was examined through the lens of succession. Every friendship became speculation. Every public appearance generated headlines asking the same question: who will become Monaco's next princess? Long before Albert married, several women publicly claimed that he had fathered their children. Legal proceedings eventually confirmed 2 children born outside marriage. Albert acknowledged his responsibilities as a father, but the stories dominated newspapers around the world. For supporters of the Grimaldi legend, the headlines seemed familiar. Once again, the royal family's private life had become public spectacle. Historians offered a simpler explanation. Europe's monarchies had entered an age where constant media attention exposed every personal decision. What previous generations managed to keep behind palace walls now unfolded before millions of readers. Whether viewed as extraordinary misfortune or the unavoidable cost of modern royalty, the Grimaldis remained unable to separate their personal lives from public fascination. Everything appeared to change in 2011. Prince Albert announced his engagement to Charlene Wittstock, an Olympic swimmer from South Africa. Calm, disciplined, and deeply committed to sport, Charlene seemed very different from the actresses and aristocrats who had previously surrounded European royalty. Their wedding filled Monaco's streets with celebration. Once again, television cameras from around the world broadcast scenes from the prince's palace. Commentators compared the ceremony to Rainier and Grace Kelly's wedding more than half a century earlier. The dynasty finally had its princess. 3 years later, Charlene gave birth to twins, Princess Gabriella and hereditary Prince Jacques, securing the line of succession for another generation. It seemed that the Grimaldi family had entered its most stable chapter in decades. That sense of stability proved short-lived. In 2021, while visiting South Africa for wildlife conservation work, Princess Charlene developed severe ear, nose, and throat complications that required multiple medical procedures. Doctors advised her not to fly. Weeks became months. Months became nearly a year. During her absence, newspapers across Europe and around the world published endless speculation. Some claimed the marriage was collapsing. Others suggested Charlene had left Monaco permanently. None of those rumors reflected the official medical explanations provided by the palace, yet they spread rapidly because the Grimaldi name had long been associated with tragedy and mystery. When Charlene finally returned to Monaco, she soon entered a treatment facility to recover from physical exhaustion and emotional fatigue following her prolonged illness. Prince Albert publicly asked for privacy, explaining that his wife needed time to heal. Gradually, Charlene resumed public appearances beside her husband and children, smiling before cameras that had spent months predicting the end of their marriage. Even then, the whispers continued. Every photograph was analyzed, every expression interpreted. Every absence became another headline. Whether fair or unfair, The Grimaldi family had reached a point where ordinary hardships were rarely allowed to remain ordinary. The legend had become so deeply woven into public imagination that every challenge was viewed through the shadow of a story first told 7 centuries earlier. History cannot tell us whether a curse was ever spoken beneath the walls of medieval Monaco. It cannot tell us the forgotten woman's name, or whether she ever existed beyond legend. What history can show us is a remarkable dynasty that endured extraordinary success while repeatedly confronting extraordinary personal loss. Some see coincidence. Others see the burden of living every moment beneath the gaze of the world. Still others believe the old legend still echoes through the halls of the prince's palace. Whatever conclusion you reach, the story of the House of Grimaldi reminds us that wealth, power, and titles have never guaranteed happiness, and that the choices remembered by history often outlive the people who made them. Thank you for joining Tilt and Chill. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten legends, hidden histories, and enduring mysteries that continue to shape our world, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past.